Okay, we're going to begin. I'm very, very pleased this evening to welcome distinguished ethicist, feminist theorist, and artist, Denise Ferreira da Silva, who is professor and director of the Institute for Gender, Race, and Sexuality and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Denise is our keynote speaker for this evening, and her talk is entitled On Exhaustion, a reading on psychical economy. She's the author of Toward a Global Idea of Race, A da Vida Impagável, Unpayable Debt, amongst many other publications, and her work has appeared in Social Text, Theory, Culture, Society, Social Identities, Philosophia, Theory and Event, The Black Scholar, and elsewhere. I'd also like to mention Denise's artistic works, the film Serpent Rain, Four Waters Deep Implicancy, in collaboration with Arjuna Neumann, and the relational art practices, poetical readings, and sensing salon in collaboration with Valentina Desideri. She's exhibited and lectured at the Pompidou Center, at Whitechapel Gallery in London, MASP in Sao Paulo, at the Guggenheim in New York, and MoMA, amongst other locations. Denise's keynote this evening is our final event of a day-long symposium on the theme of mass intellectuality, with a question mark, a problem that will continue to frame our concerns into the coming academic year. My warm thanks to Sarah Cole, Dean of Humanities, for supporting the Institute, and my thanks to the Institute for Research in African American Studies and to the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies for their co-sponsorship. Ferreira da Silva has extended Horton Spiller's reconfiguration of woman in ways that disorder the modern grammar of race patriarchy and feminist reason. And she travels with Caribbean theorist Sylvia Wynter, who challenges the equivalence of man and the human as an act of conceptual trickery, even as she acknowledges its role in worlding, in delineating social historical trajectories. By returning us to the problem of flesh, of enfleshment as figure and ground, of the global color line, Denise opens the initial framing of the problem, think Du Bois, to scrutiny. She troubles it by reminding us of the double refusal that marks the place of Black feminism. X marks the spot. She writes, a thinking that refigures the doings of Black women, approaches the critical plus creative always in reference to a mode of existing as a condition of the world and not a condition of being in the world, I repeat, that yields that which is at once a feat, a deed, a burden, and an artifact, end quote. This is one way to work the grammar of race as worlding through the prism of female flesh ungendered, to quote Spillers again. That is, if we take the question of worlding as both a problem of historical ontology and knowledge, then it's fair to say that it is the aesthetic question, which is also the existential question, that returns us to immanence, to Black immanence. Exorbitant object in the margins, edited out of view, haunt man as the locus of self-determination and self-realization through the developmental arc that is history in Denise's work. Existence, implicancy, the decomposition and the recomposition of the world through the heat of work and exhaustion. Perhaps this is the line that we're asked to trace when we ask, as Denise does, how and not if or whether or when Black women exist, care, teach, travel, and engage in so many goings-on. I'm reminded here of the work of my friend, the late Aniket Zaure, who worked on outcastness, on untouchability in the Indian caste context, but did so by turning the problem around completely, by inquiring into the problem of touch and not untouchability, what Fanon might refer to as a corporeal schema, at the risk of mixing up my concept metaphors. These are fellow travelers all who walk the wild side of the autobiography of the human. And it is in the context of this broader questioning of worlding, the human, and the subject who is exorbitant to the Eurocentric subject-object of thought, that the question of access, of enclosure, of exclusion into the domain of thought itself, and the university as a particular social form is opened up for us. And this is a problem and a question that Denise Ferreira da Silva will pose and engage today. Moderating the session with me and engaging with Professor da Silva will be my good friend and beloved colleague, Saidiya Hartman, who really needs no introduction here. Her book, Wayward Lives, became a classic on its publication. And the questions that it poses there and previously in other work about the archive of gendered subaltern lives and the practices of pleasure and refusal will be with us for a very long time, as are the powerful questions that Saidiya poses about critical fabulation as method, strategy, and aesthetic practice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva this evening for her talk on exhaustion. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you so much, Anu, for this very kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this important program. And I'd like to thank Saidiya for agreeing to be part of the conversation this evening, and obviously Sarah for organizing it and making it possible and so smooth. It's really, really a pleasure to be here. And I have a rather, I think, short presentation, and I'm going to be moving between PowerPoint and myself, hopefully smoothly, but one never knows. Well, thanks, folks, for being here. So when I first heard the term pandemic fatigue, I did not understand. I did understand the terms and the meaning of the phrase. What I didn't understand at first was why it was a thing. No, it didn't make sense to me why so much attention was given to the fact that people would get tired of the restrictions put in place to mitigate the pandemic, and that they would stop self-isolating, wearing masks, or keeping distance. No, that was to be expected. But I didn't understand until I realized that pandemic fatigue is part of the COVID-19 biopolitical framework, which was assembled by governments, multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization, and medical professional organizations, and of course, academics, university workers like us. Let me just share something with you here. I hope you can see this. I can't even ask if you can see this or not. So, like for instance, you can. Okay, good. Dr. Paul Nystad, who says this, made this statement. If I hear one more time that Shakespeare wrote King Lear while in quarantine during a pandemic, I'm going to lose it. So Nystad is an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. So when explaining pandemic fatigue, Dr. Nystad, as others, use the term exhaustion. And this is a mental and physical tiredness attributed to having to spend, and I'm going to quote again from the same report, having to spend, quote, extra time and energy dealing with the new pandemic lifestyle and all the struggles it's brought on, end quote. And then the report, that's not him saying, but the report goes on to list the consequences of being mentally and physically exhausted. It lowers resilience, boosts feelings of dread and helplessness, lower your ability to cope, which makes you, and I'm going to quote again, less motivated to do anything about those negative feelings. So you end up feeling more on the edge, anxious and exhausted by all these feelings. end quote. Let me just come back because. So I'm not going to get into what many of you, I think, or maybe most of you must be thinking right now, but like thinking about Black folks. Now we have to self-impose restrictions due to the predictability of and the relentless possibility of it be deadly of an encounter with law enforcement. And I'm not going to say that, but I will say that may account for why I missed the significance of pandemic fatigue until I realized that the naming of the disease introduced its cure. So the solutions which are presented, in this usual way of the biopolitical framework of state capital, so they are very much the same. Like it's through the individualizing of the causes, presenting the situation in terms of a calculation of costs and benefits, talking about coping with the limiting of self-determination or freedom, and also presenting strategies that can be used for addressing the frustration deriving from the lack of efficacy of our individual actions, and also for dealing with the extra time it takes to follow the safety protocols, which basically don't seem to do their jobs, as the risk of being infected, falling ill, or dying would remain. So it's precisely the significance of failed efficacy and sequentiality, that which should follow, the failure of that which should follow an action or decision, whether immediately as an effect or later in time, the fact that it doesn't happen, that the significance of that failure in the discourse of pandemic, and of course, that failure is what they say is, that is what underlie all the causes for this mass exhaustion. That is the reason I thought it relevant in a commentary that speaks to the question that is the title of this conference, right? Mass intellectuality. As you may have anticipated, that I cannot but consider the questioning of mass intellectuality explicit in the title, but also of the general intellect that is implied in the title. I cannot consider it but through the question with which Blackness confronts any critical statement, be that theoretical or aesthetical. And that question, regardless of its actual formulation, always first confronts the subject of reflection, the transparent eye. So in this reading, which is really a very early draft of something I'm just starting to think about, I'm using this crazy, weird phrase, psychical economy, to indicate that I'm approaching the thing of reflection, the transparent eye, in the economic scene of value. And I am primarily interested in how the reduction of the mind, and when I say the mind, I'm thinking about, also that which goes beyond the intellectual, emotional, and also what comes under the term spiritual. So I'm interested in how the reduction of the mind to a thing of reflection, right? Kind of like the reduction of that to reflection, allows it to be apprehended in the physical sense of apprehension too, to be apprehended much in the same way everything else on this planet has been apprehended in order to meet the needs of the juridic economic formation that has prevailed in the past 200 years or so. So that's basically what I'm interested in. And this presentation is kind of my walking the steps, some of the steps necessary for considering how the mind has been apprehended, become a site for state capital. Now, I know this is an undeniably abstract exercise, but I do hope that it unfolds in a way that contributes to the increasingly, what I found as an increasingly sophisticated list of texts that tackle the challenging task of taking on the university, but do so without the romance of its once upon a time, inclusionary and progressive mandate. And then, of course, I'm referring here to the abolitionist approach, which I find most compelling when there is no pretense of advancing the challenge from some holy place of pure radicality. And that I say because I think we need to recognize and contend with this shared predicament. So I say this as someone who would not be here if it weren't for the university, but that from the very beginning. It was the place where I was born. I was born in the maternity school of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the same university I entered at the age of 17, and well, I haven't left really. So those of us for whom the university has been either refuge, rescue, or both, while at the same time being a boxing ring, we must deal with the historical facts that we also benefit from colonial expropriation and slavery. And we also have to deal with how our critical scholarship very quickly becomes part of the biopolitical framework to which the university contributes and will serve the general functioning and survival of the very institutions our writing and our writings and our thought thinking militate against. So from this, here, there, from our impossible position of address, I wrote this outline, which I think comments on 3 moments highlighted by the abolitionist university approaches that Nick Mitchell and others advance. So I'm commenting on very generally on the university as a site of production of subjectivities, as a site of manufacturing and development and deployment, of critical tools. And I'm also exploring something, some other way, what I think is hope is some other way of going about the work I and many others love to do, which is to think. And the task it can perform best, which I think is to confront and dissolve the infrastructures of modern thought. Now, the ontopsemological pillars, separability, determinacy, and sequentiality, and descriptors, formality, and efficacy. So in this piece that I'm sharing with you today, I'm commenting directly on 2 of those, on sequentiality and efficacy. And as I said, what I'm doing is it's very straightforward. So I'm going to start with a commentary on general intellect and mass intellectuality. Then I move to speculate a bit on exhaustion. And then I conclude with a comment on reverberation and not reflection as the privileged image for the first person singular. And those will be really comments, not much elaboration. So let me start with Paulo Virno's take on the general intellect and mass intellectuality, as it's presented in the short piece titled General Intellect, which was published in 2001. And so his main argument, as I understand, is about harnessing the transformative potential of what he calls mass intellectuality, which for him includes much more than scientific knowledge and the knowledge produced by the university, etc. So here I'll go back to sharing screen and the quote. Okay, so I have to say I have a few very long quotes, and just bear with me. It's a presentation of text because I want to make sure you can follow me. So I'm just going to read so I follow the length of the quote as time. In post-Fordism, conceptual and logical schema play a decisive role and cannot be reduced to fixed capital, insofar as they are inseparable from the interaction of a plurality of living subjects. The general intellect includes formal and informal knowledge, imagination, ethical tendencies, mentalities, and language games. Thoughts and discourses function in themselves as productive machines in contemporary labor and do not need to take on a mechanical body or an electronic soul. The matrix of conflict and the condition for small and great disorders under the sky must be seen in the progressive rupture between general intellect and fixed capital that occurs in this process of redistribution of the former within living labor. End quote. So under these conditions, another formation of labor, mass intellectuality, gains relevance. And then again, it's going to be, as a longish quote. So Virno on mass intellectuality. Mass intellectuality is the composite group of post-Fordist living labor, not merely of some particularly qualified third sector. It is the depository of cognitive competences that cannot be objectified in machinery. And it is the prominent form in which the general intellect is manifest today. All the more generic attitudes of the mind gain primary status as productive resources. These are the faculty of language, the disposition to learn, memory, the power of abstraction and relation, and the tendency toward self-reflexivity. General intellect needs to be understood literally as intellect in general, the faculty and power to think rather than the works produced by thought, a book, an algebra formula, etc. In order to represent the relationship between general intellect and living labor in post-Fordism, we need to refer to the act through which every speaker draws on the inexhaustible potential of language to execute contingent and unrepeatable statements. Like the intellect and memory, language is the most common and least specialized conceivable given. A good example of mass intellectuality is the speaker, not the scientist. Mass intellectuality has nothing to do with the new labor aristocracy. It is actually the opposite. So what I read in Virno's description of mass intellectuality is precisely a repetition of the gesture that would become typical in the interpretive moment of the post-Enlightenment episteme, and here I'm talking about the 20th century, which is to offer language or some other mental attribute considered creative to counter the scientific and formal rendering of something. And I didn't comment on Marx, but in this quote, both quotes are part of his disagreeing with Marx's formulation of general intellect, which focus on scientific knowledge production and the technological innovations they allow. So this is what Virno is countering here. So, but Virno's version of this gesture is more sophisticated in that it's not a mere distinction between the formal and the spiritual, or the scientific and the historical, or the determinative and the interpretive. There is more to that. But it is also simple in the good sense, because his general intellect encompasses everything but, and I'm quoting again, the abstractions typical of modernity that embodied the principle of equivalence. As such, it differs, so general intellect differs from money, right? What he calls the independent abstract measure for everything, because according to Virno, the general intellect, and I'm quoting him, establishes the analytical premises for any kind of praxis, end quote, and does not, quote again, turn varied laboring activities into equivalents. Rather, they present themselves as immediately productive forces, or as immeasurable presupposition, or the immeasurable presupposition of heterogeneous effective possibilities. So from here, from make this distinction between general intellect and and that, and the principle of equivalence, which you would characterize both, right? Scientific knowledge, but also the assignation of value through the equal sign. From here, Virno moves on to his critique of the principle of equivalence more so. And there he states, quote, the principle of equivalence used to be the foundation of the most rigid hierarchies and ferocious inequalities, end quote. But it also, quote, ensured a sort of visibility in the social nexus, as well as a simulacra of universality, end quote. So several moves are signaled here, but I'm going to mention only what I think is the core of the argument in that whole piece, which to me indicates that Virno's is a critique of state capital, which is concerned with the desirable functioning of what is still a liberal juridic formation that would survive, like the capitalist economic form. So as he puts it in the very last sentence of this very short piece, and I quote, the subversion of capitalist relations can only manifest itself through the institutions of a public sphere outside the state and of a political community that rings on the general intellect, end quote. Well, so if that's the case, if in the post-Fordist moment, mental, psychical, right, cognitive and affective, as well as manual capabilities have become crucial to designation of value, both, as they generate the elements that enter in the montage of the equation of value that allows for the determination of value of something, then it makes sense to try and describe how the mental becomes available for this process beyond its application in the production of knowledge. So I'm kind of following with Virno here. But I disagree in one thing, which at least in this particular presentation of his argument, that appears in this presentation of this argument. And I disagree with this because I believe that in the last couple of centuries, interiority itself, and that not only what is felt and what's known, but the very locus where knowing and feeling are supposed to take place, interiority itself has become a site of investment for the state capital. Not as something that as a dimension of the human that was appropriated, like the last commons that have now been enclosed, but as something that was constituted along with the human as a species and humanity as an ethical concept. And I'm talking about, right, post-enlightenment, late enlightenment, post-enlightenment. So I find it in both Kant and Hegel's version of the transcendental doing that work. And so interiority is produced as a site in the very moment of its appropriation, or the appropriation takes place in the very delineation of the site. And that appropriation, for that appropriation, I'm using the term apprehension. And that apprehension turns interiority into a moment of production and also an element in the assignation of value. So I can say it in a very different way. So far from assuming that is in this, it is an untapped recourse for resistance, which would constitute a mass intellectuality, I find that state capital's apprehension of the mind also needs to come under investigation. Interiority and its products are not there, it's still available to us untouched. So I'm calling it psychical economy, this apprehension of interiority or of the mental, to signal the need for a move that I don't think is that different than Marx's critique that turned political economy upside down. But that's some other work. I'm just identifying something here. So okay, so what does it have to do with exhaustion? Or actually, what does exhaustion have to do with the mass intellectuality and the question mark that accompanies it in this conference? So I became interested in doing this work because of this real proliferation of talks on exhaustion and mental illness. I think perhaps the most disturbing characteristic of this discourse on the pandemic fatigue, and it is disturbing, but it's not unexpected, but anyway, it is how it renders the person the sole responsible for, right, the cause and effect of its occurrence. So my negative feelings about a situation come from the fact that I can't do anything about it, and that makes me exhausted, the doctors say. So I have another long quote here from a piece that was published in the American Medical Association site back in 2000, also 2021. I don't know. The reason doesn't want to let me move it. Okay, this is this. So this is a little long piece, but I'm going to do the reading to follow. So this the title of the piece is What Doctors Wish Patients Knew about the pandemic. So, but before I get to the, sorry, I was too fast. Before I get to that long piece, I have some other things to say. But I'll leave this one over there, so I don't have to play with the PowerPoint. So in this other piece that I found on the website of the American Medical Association from January 2021, I find some repetition of the logic that Dr. Nidstedt, I talked about before. And the logic is that the people are tired of restrictions, right? They're tired of wearing the mask, they're fed up, they are experiencing a burnout. So this is repeated in different places. But what doctors say, first thing, you should recognize the signs. So for like Dr. Carl Lambert, who is an assistant professor of family medicine and director of the Family Medicine Leadership Program at the Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, he said, and I'm quoting him, probably the most noteworthy feeling is a sense of ineffectiveness in life. So what do you do with that sense? The answers are the usual: stay strong, seek mental health care, find community. Dr. Yap, for instance, plays computer games online. And Dr. Lambert also says, and I quote, with COVID-19 fatigue, you are tired in your soul, emotionally, psychologically, socially, and spiritually, end quote. Why are you tired? Well, Dr. Lambert had said already, it's of your ineffectiveness. Your actions don't have the results you expect, anticipate, and there is no sense of advancement in time. So Dr. Yap says, and I'm quoting again, you feel like a dog that's just paddling in the pool, not really knowing where you're going. You lose a lot of your momentum and the feeling that you are rowing, end quote. And then he adds, as humans, we like to do something where we are moving toward, to have something we are moving towards. And when we don't even know when the end point of something is, how can we move towards it, end quote. So lack of movement of things, of self, the failure to trust in that if you do something, you get something else, or you reach over there. at the end of the process, right, in the future, those are presuppositions, simple things taken for granted, simple taken for granted things that the discourse on the pandemic fatigue mentioning those things, the discourse on the pandemic fatigue tells us of the centrality of efficacy and sequentiality. And that's to both, to the scientific understanding and to the lay people's understanding of how a healthy mind should function. This healthy mind is obviously the rational one, the one who knows, as Dr. Lambert says. It knows it has or can have control over things and make decisions now that will have an effect later. And now here comes this long quote, which was published actually in the Scientific American. And that's by David Badre, a neuroscientist at Brown University. So, and I'm going to quote, read the quote. Pandemic fatigue should be understood in terms of motivation for the tasks we choose to do. As such, lessons from the psychology and neuroscience of cognitive control may be informative. Humans have a remarkable capacity to conceive of a task they have never done before and plan and execute the actions needed to do it. We can do this because of a class of function scientists termed cognitive control. Importantly, cognitive control is motivated. When deciding to do a task, our control system balances at least two factors: the value we get from doing that task and the costs we will experience while doing so. Importantly, however, our control system also takes account of our mental efficacy when computing this value, as in how much mental investment is needed to gain from a particular task. Those people want to do just any amount of mental work for any outcome. Difficult tasks, and particularly tasks involving heavy mental investment, come with an aversive experience of mental effort. End quote. That makes me think of my students. Okay, so that I learned how a healthy mind operates when I was trying to get some idea of what pandemic fatigue is, something I should have expected that I would learn about it, but still surprised me as much as how the pandemic has made this biopolitical operation so evident. But I did learn. I did learn that pandemic fatigue is either exhaustion or lack of motivation, according to Badre, and that for the World Health Organization, the two are actually related. So, and I'm just quoting here, pandemic fatigue is understood in this document. That's a document by the World Health Organization that was prepared for Europe. And the title of the document is Pandemic Fatigue, Reinvigorating the Public to Prevent COVID-19, Policy Framework for Supporting Pandemic Prevention and Management, and was produced by the World Health Organization Europe in 2020. And then it says, and I'm quoting, pandemic fatigue is understood in this document as a demotivation to follow recommended protective behaviors emerging gradually over time and affected by a number of emotions, experiences, and perception. End quote. There is a lot here, but what among the many things that are there, what I'm highlighting in this discourse on pandemic fatigue, or maybe I should say what calls my attention or what has grabbed my attention are those indications that in this post-Fordist moment of capitalism, that it includes more than what Virno says, and I'm quoting again, more than what he says, quote, entering the production of commodities becomes part of the use value of labor power and is computed as profitable resource, end quote. Because that's kind of what happens to the general intellect in his argument. So not dissimilar to Virno's critique of Marx's view of the general intellect, scientific knowledge as the main productive force as fully coinciding with fixed capital. So not dissimilar than that critique that Virno does not agree with Marx. I find that Virno's notion of mass intellectuality needs a treatment that takes into account this biopolitical statement I have been commenting on. As I said earlier, it needs an analysis of mental capacities, and I'm using capacities for lack of a better name, or an analysis of the psychical, of how it has become a site for state capital. And I think such treatment would include several moves. One of them is a consideration of whether labor is still the central economic category and production the principal privileged moment in the assignation of value. And of course, I'm not going to enter into these considerations here. And then if anyone asks me a question about that, I won't have time to answer that. So because this is only an outline, but I will share with you some questions. I have questions about it. And I questions that I'm starting to gather, but then questions that come from thinking in other texts. So and those questions are very straightforward, such as what if, instead of focusing on labor as a description of the economic scene, on labor, what if the description of the economic scene focused on what Marx calls the subjects of labor, the soil and the other raw materials it yields? And instead of starting with the production, the description of the economic cycle started with the seizing of the things, the physical apprehension of these materials. And what if apprehension and not production were the privileged moment in that account? What if whatever becomes of the raw materials when integrated with others in the production is something inherent in it? It's elementary components. What's important about it? What if labor thought as primarily the application of human mental abilities, right? Because that's how Marx kind of describes the labor, distinguishes labor from what the spider does. So what if labor were not the locus of production, but another instrument of apprehension, if we looked at that? And then, of course, here I'm talking about the concept itself, but that's something we can talk about during the Q&A. So, but when asking these questions, I also have in mind both Kant's and Husserl's figurines of the pure I, of that thing of reflection, whose defining moment is precisely that of apprehension of what lies out there, of what exists, or which is it apprehends as object of knowledge, as nature in the Kantian formulation, or as its context of existence in the Husserlian formulation as world. So my point here in regards to both is that not only the latter, nature or world, but Kant's pure I and Husserl's first person, which I think is the one presupposed in a term that Virno uses in regards to mass intellectuality, right, life worlds. So those two are also constituted as sites of appropriation, as elements in the assignation of value in that same statement. So I'm just going to repeat a little bit. So when I ask it, what if production is not the primary moment of generation, creation of exchange value, and labor is not what creates it, I'm also moving towards collapsing the distinction between manual and mental labor and all the others that come from it, including that between cognitive and that which includes cognitive and affective labor. Because I think that any consideration of any mental activity as having any role to play in confronting global capital will have to start with the same kind of interrogation Marx unleashed when considering living labor as physical activity. Of course, Marx also added that the productive capacity resulted from the human's ability to design their actions, that is, from self-determination and the small scale, the ability to decide on how and to what ends to use their hands, feet, and other body parts. So the interrogation of the thesis of the productivity of the mind has to begin with a consideration of the thesis that productivity is primarily mental. Along with that, productivity has to be considered in the proper context, which is time, since it is a mental capacity and the mind since the mind in modern philosophy is described as a thing of time. And then, of course, for that reason, it also should include considerations of the apprehension of the mind in as time, and the work that apprehension does for capital. So if the question of efficacy and mental health organized in the discourse on pandemic fatigue and the classic Marxist definition of productivity of labor as due to the human capacity to determine and design its action, if both make it rather straightforward, the figuring of how the thing of reflection become an element of assignation of value, the work done by time requires, I think, more consideration. So basically, I'm just saying that if efficacy makes it kind of straightforward, looking at how reflection would, be a modality of apprehension for the production of value, time is a bit more complicated, and it is because it is here, and here I find something that I think seems to escape Virno's proposition regarding mass intellectuality in that short piece, and that this has to do with the centrality of time in the account of production of exchange value, not only Marx's deployment of it as an abstraction, right? That abstraction which allows for translate labor, which is a qualitative thing, into something measurable. So here I'm referring to the Hegelian sense of time being the screen for the appreciation of the actualization of spirit by human actions and passions. So these philosophical statements that articulate time in particular as sequentiality, as the screen that reflects, projects the eye, the ones through which the screen through which the eye can appreciate the actualization of its doings as evidence of its transparency, and of its self-determined and self-improving being. That also demands some evidence, right? That evidence has to be presented of this transparency and of this improvement or development. Failing to do so, in the case of both of those who are supposed to, but cannot recognize themselves, have that evidence, and those who are not supposed to recognize themselves in time, renders them lesser humans, as Sylvia Winterwood might put it, or as humans without humanity and subjectivity, as I would say. My point here is that the demand for expectation or desire or hope for self-knowledge, recognition, transparency, etc., indicates how in modern thinking, time has become a means for preoccupying the mind by tying it to itself as something that has no similar thing in existence formally. Formally beyond other minds with similar traits and attributes. And that would be substantively as conveyed by the notions of raciality and or the nation. So in considering exhaustion in its connection to time, both become relevant, both Marx's time as measure for the determination of productivity and the production of exchange value, and Hegel's time as screen reflecting identity with self or nature. Here I find Deleuze's comments on exhaustion and its relation to the possible very helpful. And I'm almost done with these quotes, but I'll have Deleuze up there. It is, those are two big quotes. And I'm just gonna, again, read it to make the time go. Exhaustion is altogether different. You combine the set of variables of a situation, provided you renounce all order of preference and all organization of goal, all signification. You no longer realize, even though you accomplish, in shoes you stay in slippers you go out. That does not mean that you fall into indifferentiation or into the celebrated identity of contraries, and you are not passive, you press on, but toward nothing. You are tired of by something, but exhausted by nothing. The disjunction subsists, and the distinction of terms may even be more and more crude, but the disconnected terms assert themselves through their non-decomposable distance, since all there are food for. Oh, I think this, my copying from one to another just made the, just destroyed the text. Sorry about that. And the second quote, on the exhausted, only the exhausted can exhaust. Yeah, it totally destroyed copying it. Only the exhausted can exhaust the possible, because he has renounced all need, preference, goal, or signification. Only the exhausted is sufficiently disinterested, sufficiently scrupulous. Indeed, he is obliged to replace projects with tables and programs denuded of sense. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. I'm interested in the intimations of time in Deleuze's quotes, but also in the whole analysis of Beckett that he develops in this text. So if the exhausted has exhausted the possible, this is a mental situation. The tired is a physical one, which has also physical consequences, as Deleuze says. But I'm even more interested in identifying at least some of the mechanisms through which time hijacks the possible as a demand for actualization, as commodity or other product in the screen of time. So as that demand for actualization subordinates possibility to probability of occurrence, that is to something that is verifiable in space-time. So focusing on one of the four ways Deleuze names exhausting the possible, namely the exhaustive series of things, in a reading of Fanon, Fred Moulton moves with the exhaustive exhausting, which he finds in Coltrane, who he Moulton finds, and I'm quoting, becoming the instrument, a conduit, a means to the long history of exhumations, is still extant capacity to catapult us, exhaustion, sorry, is to extent capacity to catapult us into and as the old new thing, end quote. That he contrasts with Fanon's dealing with the impossible, which, quote, will always have been waiting. So this distinction between what catapults us into and what will always be waiting for, the impossible, emphasize something in which Deleuze seems less interested about the exhausted. And there is something, the discourse on the pandemic fatigue privileges, which is precisely the occlusion of time, both in efficacy, the assurance of a later effect of an action performed now, and sequentiality as the screen of actualization of effects of the succession of actions and desires. And this is what I find exposes how the thing of reflection is constituted for by state capital. But this is not, however, how I want to conclude this first attempt at reading the Psychical economy. I want to close with something I see as a first gesture, an initial move as I attend to a possibility housed in the inaccessibility of Black interiority from without these very infrastructures, such as efficacy and sequentiality. And also the interior thing that they create, like subjectivity. So this is a task I find requested in Saidiya Hartman's work, thinking that begins with how Blackness confronts subjectivity is the task. I can list a number of texts that host it, but I find the questioning that is Blackness and something, that kind of questioning Blackness in something Horton Spiller says in a text that brings the argument from her dissertation. And that's going to be my last I can't believe this is not working. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing because somehow my computer is having a problem. So I'm just going to read it. It's a short one. I quote, "Through the Protestant sermon of exhortation, I here have the word at last in a gesture of intervention that the physical and the psychic violence of the North American slave trade neither anticipated nor could ward off. The African-American church, therefore, sustains a special relationship of attentiveness to the literal word that liberates," end quote. A gesture of intervention that the physical and psychic violence of the North American slave trade neither anticipated nor could ward off. That word, it is definitely the word. It is also how it sounds. Exhortation is a sounding of a kind. It is supposed to touch, to move, to incite. If the word of exhortation is a call, then it also is itself its realization. What I gathered by literalness of the word. One could say that there is something in that sounding that breaches the distance, temporal or spatial, between the possible, the potential, and the actual, or real as realized or actualized. Existing as such in that moment of resounding the word I is the deed. Spiller seems to suggest, or at least not to deauthorize the reading. It is the gesture of intervention. That instantaneity, that immediacy I find suggested is a rendering of the first person singular, which is not the individual, the first person, because it is everyone's in that moment of exhortation and only then. So it is not another name for Black subjectivity if conceived as ego. I want to say that from the outset, but it is a name for something that occurs as such, as a first person singularity, as the word I does or could or might echo infinitely. Thank you for your patience.
Denise, thank you. I think we need to be with this and we'll need to be with this for a while. Saidiya, I wanted to ask if you wanted to jump in.
Denise, you have given us so much. So I guess maybe I wanted to start at the end because you began by saying that there's a way that the problem of exhaustion provides the answer. I don't know if you said the cure to a certain, arrangement of this psychical economy. So that was one part. And then in terms of thinking about the inaccessibility of Black interiority for, for efficacy and sequentiality, the way that interiority, can't be touched by or isn't anticipated by this kind of order of racial slavery, or, we might also say the way it alludes or is inaccessible to a schema of cognitive control or cognitive mastery. So I just wanted you to speak more about that, because in ending on the note of, the inaccessibility of Black interiority, I was thinking about you offer us this kind of elaborate articulation of this psychical economy in which the mind, knowing, feeling, the capacity of reflection becomes the site of capital's production of value, right? But then you're also giving us a kind of a site to think about how that might be exceeded or broken. So if you could start there, that'd be great.
Thank you, Saidiya, for actually coming up with the question in this very general, and it's a little assemblage. Like I have this image of there is a core here, and then I have all those pieces, and I keep coming back to the core to bring the pieces together. So it's failing linearity, but I can see that it's not completely, dispersed out there. So I think I will start with the last comment that you made, because I think that is a comment that to which I'll go back. I mean, both of them are comments to which I'll go back and elaborate, because they're asking me for that elaboration. So I'm going to start with the inaccessibility of Black interiority, which is really, I keep saying that, and I'm always going to say that. That's something that comes to me from reading your work. It's like, and to me it's more, so Glissant talks about opacity, but opacity doesn't quite get there because it is a statement that is a description, but when you read through, take into account the mechanisms of power, then you can see that the movement of violence is not, even if the movement of violence is a movement towards obliteration, it never gets there, because the violence is precisely the statement of the inexistence of something that is stated as we're attempting to destroy it and calling it inexistent. So the movement, that movement that renders something like a Black interiority both possible, thinkable, and livable, but inaccessible, undescriptable, in a way I'm using something similar to describe in the pandemic fatigue, the creation of this healthy mind through the description of the general mental unhealthiness that all of a sudden has come to us. Why? Because the creation of the healthy mind comes in the typical biopolitical way with the recipes for functioning, right? And that is what occupies us. So we're preoccupied by the anticipation of not being effective. And then we have, even in these popular magazines, recipes for how then you keep yourself healthy. But that keeping yourself healthy is not anything about the mind, but the things that you do and occupy your time. So that's going to your second question. In both, then there is this movement of it is an introduction. It is an introduction of that which you capture, right? The capturing in the very moment of presentation of what is, in one case, what is not there. So in case of Blackness, the failure, because the movement is one of announcing that it's not there. And in the case of the pandemic fatigue, it is, in the biopolitical, not the necropolitical, so use the distinction. It is one of actually creating other ways for us to be preoccupied by capital as we continue to fail to remain healthy, right? Because the whole point of this economy is that you have to be not healthy. Like kind of, I'm calling it economy just also because of the sense of the lack, the scarcity, right? This idea of scarcity, but not as a scarcity, but in this case, as being unhealthy. So that's one of, those are two things that I can say, but I could say more to in response to your comment.
But I had a follow-up question, and that was about apprehension, which seemed like a very, very productive mood, because, when I saw the Virno quote, I was like, oh, post-Fordism and labor, we're in such a kind of particular narrative, but, and really thinking about this mode of apprehension, you're so pushing against that Marxist framing. And I want you to say more about that, because you say like, okay, the economic scene is actually not defined by production. So what happens when we move to thinking about apprehension? So if you would just say more about that.
I can say more about that. I wish, eventually I'll be able to say more and better than what I'm going to say now. But just generally, the move, there is another way of describing it, which is, I could talk about extraction, but extraction also happens later. But just thinking, but still talking about the apprehension of what's out there. So we talk about colonial appropriation of indigenous lands. So those are all and appropriation of persons in the African continent. So those are all moves that were and continue to be crucial for capital to maintain itself, right? Where it's still extracting, it's still apprehending and appropriating. So the inversion there, so they have two inversions. One is to add another moment to that production, circulation, distribution that Marx has in the introduction to the Grundrisse, and add apprehension to that moment. And then in doing so, two things can happen, become possible I can say them, and then I can present them in different ways. So on the one hand, the movement of apprehension, of course, there is an intention, there is a design in there, but that design does not have the role that Marx gives to determinacy when he distinguishes between human labor and what the bee does. There is no determination necessarily in that. So that is one move that I'm making that I want to explore. And the other one, I knew it was going to go away from me. Oh yes, and the other one, but that I mentioned in this very briefly, but I think I spend more time with it in Unpayable Debt, the book. This book that is coming out eventually is also like not to talk about production at all, right? I mean, it's the displacing of production by locating, it is a displacing of production, but it's also a displacing of value in a sense. So, okay, so let me talk about the displacing of value. It's a displacing of value because that is a recognition, from the recognition that value is something that is there in that equation. That's why I'm talking about assignation of value. The value is not in the thing. The value is only in the commodity because of the assumption that human labor is productive of that value, that is exchange value. If you say that labor is not productive of value, then the thing doesn't work. So it only works within that equation in which living labor is crucial. So take the productivity of labor out of the equation, then you have the things, including the human body, that is expended in the production of things, or in the extraction of things, or in the exchange of things, or in the communication of things. And that expenditure is a physical expenditure, right? It is, it's expenditure so much so that we have to, be paid and eat and live again. So that which is expended then is what becomes part of what is, what everything that is used in the production of something, in what it enters in. I'll call it commodity because we don't have a better term for the economic object. So there is also an apprehension. I mean, there is also, it's not so much apprehension. There is also, I think the word is, the sense of a participation, right? That things participate in each other, in one another, physically, to physical, but physical in the sense of physics, the sense that is captured by physics. So I think I want to go back to something, but now I can't. Where do I want to go back? So yes, I want to go back. Let me go back to apprehension and then just summarize what I just said. So on the one hand, there is a displacing of labor as the productive activity, and with that, of the very notion of production. And on the other hand, even as we acknowledge that apprehension, there is a movement of force, of power in that relation. What's generative is not some labor as some mental capacity, but it's actually what is constitutive of the things, like materially, physically constitutive of them.
Could I jump in and sort of maybe ask for, maybe this is really sort of clarification. I mean, the question, Saidiya says, well, we start with post-Fordism and we come to Black interiority. And so that move of how you get from one to the other, it seems to me, is also part of the fact that there seem to be two kinds of language and two kinds of time and two ways of kind of making sense in what you presented. So one is the distinction of mass intellectuality and the general intellect. The other is, how do we get from post-Fordism backwards or forwards or somewhere else to get to the question of Black interiority? And then third, in terms of the kind of argument that you've sketched out for us, is this actually an argument about de-abstraction, labor as such, use value, primitive accumulation? And are we back in some sense to that space, which is what makes apprehension as the kind of total exhaustion of the body and its remnants continuing to be in the world, as it were, as so many objects, things, material that we could go back and recombine, rethink, not just through apprehension, but also in some sense as, I don't know, aesthetic innovation, the artifact contra Hegel, if I can put it that way. So is there that kind of a move here that's going on as well? You said you wanted to think a little bit more about time, and we're going forwards, backwards, and sideways in every which way in the way that you sketch out the problematic, and then introduce, I think, as Saidiya was asking, this question of apprehension and what it does and what it opens up. So where does this stand? Because on the one hand, there's a critical kind of a lexical or you're engaging the Marxist grammar and bringing us somewhere from within that logic. Mm-hmm. Another part of you is taking us somewhere completely outside of it, as Saidiya was asking. And you're doing both of these things, and it's really kind of playing with my mind.
Okay, thank you for asking this way too, because I'm starting with what in Marx remains and is fundamentally Kantian, right? Because we usually read Marx with against Hegel. I'm reading Marx with a critique of pure reason in mind, and equating the subject of labor, the subject of labor in the sense of the living labor, to the subject of knowledge as a thing of reflection, right? So Marx is a Kantian, so is Hegel, but subject of labor, subject of reflection, one of the same things. In both in the Kantian case, obviously reflection as a moment of cognition is totally interior. In Marx's case, there is an exteriorization of that subject of labor into the commodity, and that's what gives that, that in time, in social time, is what gives the value of the exchange value of the commodity. So I'm following those two movements, and I'm also number 3. Now bringing the Hegelian subject that is reflected, right? That reflects itself, that it finds itself reflected in time, historically, and the Husserlian, the phenomenological subject that is both in time, but also finds itself reflected in its world. I'm also thinking of all those, beginning with reflection is the term I've chosen just because I want to play with the Kantian program. And the thing of reflection is in all of those things, that interior thing of reflection. And this is the one I'm going after, obviously. But the going after the thing of reflection is primarily because time has been in all of these, the consistent horizon of its articulation. The question, the underlying question that I don't think I made explicit in that, or maybe I didn't make explicit, is what if time, instead of of being the horizon of liberation, is the privileged site of apprehension of interiority, right? It's flipping. So it's part of the critique of temporality, but now not so much of sequentiality, but actually looking at this interstructural moment of thinking as doing this work for the state capital in the ways that I had described. So Black interiority in what remains Black of it, in spite of all the investments of knowledge, is where it doesn't happen, right? It can never happen there. And it's always brought out to actually signal the failure of emancipation, the failure of time as the horizon of liberation. But it is not a failure of time as a horizon of liberation. Time has never been a horizon of liberation, but it has not been positively, quote unquote, positively deployed as a site for construction of Blackness, unless it has obviously it has in critical social historical analysis, but not in the production of the Black subject, right? Because the Black subject, like other racial subaltern subjects, is without time. It has no future, right? There is no such investment. It is that in modern discourse. So that is where I stand to analyze this process. But I think Saidiya has
Professor Hartman is poised for speech.
No, I just wanted to say something about the beauty of that formulation, because you ended thinking about Moten on exhaustion and Fanon on the impossible, which gets us then to the disposition of waiting. And so much like one of the most kind of fundamental assertions of a kind of Black political speech is like, why we can't wait, right? And the kind of, the seemingly reckless acts of the now is precisely about that, what you attacked in terms of efficacy, sequentiality, some notion of a developmental schema. So, and again, and that failure to have a politics structured by that sense of time is also then what totally disqualifies it as a politics too. So I just wanted to say I feel that. I feel that.
And thank you for that. And that's the beauty of, in Horten's description of the, of exhortation and the word, because it is, if you think in terms of a response, it's, it isn't the sound. Of course, I don't write about sound as nicely as I would like to, but to me, that is where, in that reverberation is where we can, where actually a political discourse that will counter and confront the existing one, that's what it's possible, because it will come out of its register, it will come out of its temporality in all the different figurations of that temporality. And it's there, it's not something to be invented, right? I think that's the beauty of it. It's not something to be invented, it's just a political context to be inhabited with costs, but also I think with lots of things that become possible, thinkable, and doable from there.
Yeah. May I take a moment to ask two questions in the Q&A, and then we could come back and wrap up. One is from an anonymous attendee. I think I'm hearing questioning that may acknowledge perhaps indigenous inclusion beyond human value time. A mind spread out the ground, Alicia Elliott, tying the mind to only human, exhaustion from pretending not to be interconnected to all beings, as I hear in Vandana Shiva. Thank you. Moses Sarubiri, I'll just read both to you. Thank you so much. I'm drawn to your engagement with psychic economy. I want to perhaps ask you about the terms that are now in popular usage, rest and leisure. Can we extend your argument on the economy of psychological labor to perhaps psychological rest and psychic enjoyment, or perhaps spacing out?
Thank you both for the comments. Questioning perhaps indigenous inclusion beyond human value. I would love if, okay, number one, I don't know that a mind spread out the ground. I don't know the text. I'm going to look for it. And Shiva also, I don't know. So hopefully Anu will help me to get more explicit of these suggestions. Acknowledging indigenous inclusion, I'm not sure what the meaning, but I think that is, as I just said, I think I just said now, I think none of these possibilities, none of these, the possible that become then, noticeable once we stand out of this kind of prison of the mind created by modern thinking. I think none of it is I think so much that of what will become possible is already part of how we think and live, and indigenous philosophies, indigenous knowledge is like such also, indigenous from all different places now, not only this continent, but the African continent and other continents. What there, so I just wouldn't use the term inclusion because I have problems with it. But I think there is an opening of what we take into account when thinking about things, and of course, definitely more explicitly, I think a commentary on the more than human, but not only. And I'm sorry, I'm going to answer this because I can't talk to you and hear more about what you are asking, anonymous person. And Moses, psychic enjoyment, or perhaps spacing out. Yeah, well, I think and this maybe actually gets what I'm saying closer to Virno and others in terms of the the different ways in which value can be, derived, not created, but derived from the different things that are once identified as a significant site for it, and I would say that we could consider those things, psychic enjoyment, rest, etc., as part of this economy. But I would not, but I don't want to think just in terms of labor or in terms of commodities, right? Because we are only usually talking about labor and commodity. I think we should think in terms of a whole, like in the same way that that is this whole apparatus that's being built for literally mining the interstellar space. We are living with this whole apparatus for a while, but it seems endless, of mining the psychical, like of actually, preparing the terrain for it to do even more work for capital in different ways. And folks have been writing about it for a long time. I started writing about it when I wrote my MA thesis on TV soap operas, and it continues to occupy me. I find it very, important as a site of engagement.
I don't want to exhaust you because we're coming close to 8 o'clock. I would love to, Saidiya, ask if you had some thoughts on what Denise has been speaking about and suggesting, but also going back to other work and other engagements.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I was thinking about the lines of connection between your talk today and unpayable debt, right? Where you're both, thinking about the, these schemas of, capital and coloniality and raciality and their, constitutive elements. And what I, really appreciate about the talk tonight is really thinking about that kind of subject of labor and that subject of reflection together, because what it means to, whether Hegel's projected I or, the reflective subject in apprehending the world, the materiality, already outside any sense of implicacy, like that's already a different scene of originary accumulation, like the violence of just, something like, the merest description is already so freighted with an order of power and violence. So I think that that's something that you do so well across the work from, towards a global idea of race. I always want to call it a global idea of race, but, is how our cognitive instruments, can only fail because they're produced by the very histories and systems that we want to use them to unlock, when in fact they're the kind of, the symptoms, they're the kind of the toolkits that is produced by the structure. So I really appreciate these efforts to, I think you use the term of like cracking the code, or what is that thing that's going to derail the machine, so this kind of like, whether it's a Wobblies or the Luddites or something, like how do we actually stop the machinery from going forward and study its constitutive parts, because even those things which are so far removed, like, the interior life is already, a site of, the production of value, or the mind, or the capacity to reflect. So obviously, then those things aren't going to be our way out, aren't going to be the way to kind of like catapult us, toward an end, or instantiate an end. So those were some of the through lines that I feel like that I noticed in this talk.
Thank you, Saidiya. I was thinking like, yeah, they're not going to catapult us, like they're dragged, right? They just keep dragging us back to having the same conversation, to doing the same critique, because, yeah.
Yeah, but this is really, yeah, I think this is really profound to think the subject of labor and the subject of reflection, and therefore altering as well the relationship between intellectual and manual labor, right? And indeed that this is not about head and hand, right? It is not about that kind of motility. It is asking and calling for something else. So that moment of apprehension is also a space, it's an interval, it's a space of a kind of quiet, and coming back to the point about Black interiority, the space to actually take time. Maybe this is the spacing out. I don't know, right? But it is that which has to be located between the future and the past, but it ain't the present, you know? So there's something very, very interesting there also then for what this implies for the political project, in a sense, in the way that I think Saidiya was asking, you know, we can't wait. So urgency, exhaustion, right? All of these things are kind of melded together in this space.
Yeah, so to me is the challenge, the call, and also, you know, the attractive thing is the thinking, is the thinking that takes all into account: what's possible, what's potential, what's virtual, what has already happened, and what is yet to happen here now, right, immediately. And I think that is in that, you know, in that call only, it touches you for that reason, because it takes you beyond space-time, beyond what is actual or what can become actual. And it is a, you know, call for a politics with imagination, right? Politics which has also to, in which waiting may be about not waiting until it happens, but waiting as it will happen. It's happening already.
I was just thinking of Saidiya's sort of play with the subjunctive, and indeed the forms, to think about the kind of formal question. And this is not about abstraction, right? So it's not about equivalence and abstraction, but apprehension stands between those as well. But yeah, I mean, this is, I don't know if this is the start of it. It feels scary to see how this is going to turn out. This is my thinking right now, but this is really magnificent, and I want to thank Saidiya. I want to thank you, Denise. I'd like to thank our audience, and thank you all for being here. And we'll wait to see what happens to this, to these initial reflections.
Thank you for inviting me for this, and thank you for conversing with me, both of you, Saidiya and Anupama.